Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In this week's video, you have my next recent reads wrap-up vlog. I am starting it off with just one book. I think the total number of books this week will be a little bit lower because the books that I'm reading are a little bit bigger. I got through a lot of my middle grade books earlier on in the month, and I've got some chunkier books to get through. I probably will finish The Wager tonight or maybe tomorrow, depending on how much time I devote to that. So the first book that I completed this week is Black AF History. So I have to do a few premises. This is not a fun, lighthearted, enjoyable read, but I had such a good time reading this book. I've talked about before, I've shown all of the snarky little comments written, on the various pictures of this very famous painting. I thought of two words to summarize this book: snarky and cynical. And that perfectly embodies my current feelings towards American history. I have little to no love for American history and the ways that it's elevated and promoted. I am very cynical when it comes to American history. On top of that, Michael Harriot has such a way with words. The way that he tells stories, there were multiple times I've mentioned that I literally snorted out loud with laughter because it just is those barbs that just cut in and are so appropriate, so witty. I think that one of the reviews or something that I read, I was looking to see if it was on the blurbs, but I think one of those reviews said that he had incisive wit, and that is so true. I am not going to be able to remember this quote exactly, but he's talking about that very common phrase, doing something over and over again. What do you get? And the quote from Einstein has to do with insanity, but he says, American? Oh my word. So this book is laid out sort of like a history book, only not strictly chronologically. And usually for someone like me, that's a instant turnoff. It was not a turnoff. It does go roughly chronologically. It talks about exploration first, then it talks about some of the earliest times in the founding, and then it moves to the Civil War era, then it moves to the Reconstruction era, and then it moves into civil rights, and then bleeding into more current dates. He actually doesn't talk a lot about current days, which is totally fine. But something else he does with the setup is after each chapter, in a textbook, sometimes it'll have multiple choice questions or short answer questions or activities or things that you're supposed to do. He has those in there. You're not supposed to actually answer the question. It's still proving the point, and it is fantastic. I love the way that he has laid out this book, the way that he highlights the stories that have been whitewashed, literally, the way that he cuts to the heart of what American history really is, and he tells the stories that need to be told, and he tells them in the way that they should be told. It is phenomenal. And I love the fact that he is also the narrator because he does such a good job with all sorts of different inflections and conversations. Like at a couple different points, he has it's like his uncle is coming in and telling stories and is like secretly, let me tell you about this. And then it's like, I can't let Michael know about this. It is so much fun. And I don't say that lightly because a lot of the things talked about in this book are very serious, very impactful. There were times, especially when he was talking about a few different examples of some lynchings, that it's very sobering and it's like you've got to wrap your mind around what's happening here. But the way that he tells this story, this is phenomenal. I'm almost tempted to put it on the shelf in my classroom library. I probably won't, unfortunately, but I think that this, even though it's written for adults, young adults, like high schoolers, middle graders even, obviously they'd have to be above like a certain age and be capable of thinking abstractly. But I think that they would love this. Well, not love it, but unless they're nerds like me. But I think that they would get a lot out of it, and it's just phenomenal. Now, it's not quite a 5-star for me. It's a 4.5, but it is a really strong entry. And if this sticks with me in my mind as I'm thinking back throughout the year, it might get bumped up to a 5. We shall see. Going forward, tonight I probably will finish The Wager by David Grann. I'll save my thoughts on that for later. The book, and I listened to this on audiobook, the book that I picked up last night for just a handful of minutes that I hopefully will finish not tomorrow, but maybe Friday, is Happiness Falls. So I'll be back whenever I finish one of those. Okay, I'm here to wrap up the vlog, excuse me. I have 2 books to talk about that I finished. 1 book to talk about that I didn't finish, but I'm done with. And then 1 book that I'm really excited for, but I'm not going to read. So I'll get to that first. What I mean by this is, almost immediately after I finished the Hafsa duology that I have the special editions right there of, I pre-ordered her new book. That book got pushed back, the publication got pushed back, so it's now almost 2 years since I pre-ordered that book. Then, lo and behold, it got picked up in a BookBox subscription. The thing about bookshop.org is you can't cancel your pre-orders. So I have my pre-order of A Tempest of Tea. I am super excited about this, but I may read this version of it and not my special edition, but long term, this one is not going to stay in my collection. This is a duplicate that I knew about, couldn't really change, but that was when I was pre-ordering things and not looking ahead, wanting to be surprised on BookBox books. Anyway, setting that aside. Now I'm going to talk about the book that I am not going to continue with. That is The River We Remember. This is the last of the mystery thriller category books that I have. I have only 2 other books on my Goodreads Choice Awards list, all of the books that I owned that were in other categories than I read. I am a little bit more than halfway through one of them, which probably will not be staying long term in my collection, and I haven't started the other one. That is the audiobook that I'm going to start later today. Now, The River We Remember. I was intrigued by it, by the setting of it, wanting to expand into the mystery thriller genre. And then when I started reading it, I didn't necessarily have a visceral reaction against it. I also wasn't intrigued by it. So the setup you have here, this is 1958. I believe it's small town Minnesota. And you have a sheriff character as the main character. He's kind of like an Andy Griffith, but not exactly. But that's the sort of sheriff vibe that you get from him. It's a lot more serious. He doesn't have a kid of his own. It opens up, I should say, with the discovery of a body. It's quickly figured out that this was a murder. Now, the person who was killed was not well loved, but he had a lot of power. He was not a nice guy at all. This main character, along with several other men in this story, have a lot of what we would today call PTSD from serving in World War II. And they deal with it in different ways. Most of them not so great. I wish I had realized before going into it who all the suspicion was going to focus on. It turns out that there is one character who is native born, and he married a Japanese woman. So already there's a lot of prejudice stacked up against him. I didn't realize until right about when I made the decision to DNF the book that he was Native American. Another thing that just sort of rubbed me the wrong way is the fact that, so the sheriff character, the main character, he has never married, but he has this one true love. Turns out his one true love is married to his brother, and they actively have a sexual relationship. So he is actively cheating with his sister-in-law. Okay. Oh, and he is the object of affection of a single mom in the area. And we have a random, at least at the point where I was at, chapter from her son. When that perspective shifted out of the blue to the son, I'm like, why are we shifting to him? Maybe he gets more perspectives later in the book, but the stuff that was conveyed in that chapter, I'm like, we didn't need to hear this from him, from this teenage boy. And of course, there's some interesting course sexual innuendo nature discussion from a friend of his. Like, why did we need this? Now, I want to make clear, it's not graphic, it's not overt, but I never connected with the characters. And I just felt sort of blah about the whole thing, at least to the point where I was reading. So I went and I looked at some of the reviews on Goodreads, and this has a really strong rating. And I was reading through a lot of them. Some of the lower rated ones mentioned some things that happened towards the end of the book in vague terms, but I could sort of figure out where it was going. And I went, you know what? I'm not engaged with this, and I don't really like that idea. So I'm not going to finish this book. Is this a bad book? I don't really know. I read a decent amount. I read over 30% of it, but this just feels like not my kind of book. It's very, very male-centric. I just have no interest in looking at things through that sort of gaze, vision, point of view. So I'm not going to be continuing in this one. Now we come to the first of the books that I finished since the last update, which I believe is the only other one. I didn't read as much this week, but that's because these books were longer. And that book is The Wager by David Grann. I was nervous going into this because I am not really a seafaring shipwreck sort of survival story person. But I carried over a lot of respect for David Grann's writing from my experience with Killers of the Flower Moon, which was one of my best books of last year. Now, this book will not make a best books, but it is really solid. And to me, this just cemented my opinion of David Grann's writing and how he is able to thoroughly research everything and bring all of the information together and create a compelling narrative. The setup of this, it takes place during the Age of Exploration, I think around the early 1700s. I don't remember the years exactly. But there was a war, basically gets to be exposed on false premises, but it was between the English and the Spanish. And as part of this, I don't remember why, but as part of this, both sides were trying to race around the world. And that meant going down around the bottom half, not the bottom half, the bottom portion of South America through the Drake Passage or somewhere around Tierra del Fuego in South America, which is extremely, extremely treacherous. And there was a whole convoy of military ships that were heading out trying to make it through this area. It is well known that the Wager, this ship, did not make it through. It was shipwrecked. The men that survived, which was a drastically reduced number from when they started out, had to survive on the island. And then months later, when everyone thinks they're dead, basically, a group makes their way to Brazil. From there back to England. And they tell the story of their dramatic survival and etc. And then 6 months later, 3 more men in horrible physical conditions make their way to Chile. And when they come back, they tell an opposite story involving mutiny. So, who's right? That's all set up in the prologue. So you know that 2 sides are going to make it back and are going to basically battle it out to determine what really happened. Now, of course, do we know definitively what happened? No, because we have to depend on these written accounts. But I really appreciated the way that David Grann ended up telling this story and putting things together. And I was compelled to keep reading, even though it's not necessarily my first choice. This ended up getting a 4.5 stars from me. Then we come to the last book that I finished this week, and that is Happiness Falls by Angie Kim. This is one that I was really intrigued by. When I selected it from Book of the Month, I knew it would be a stretch for me, but I also knew that it wasn't the stereotypical thriller, which is fine for me. I don't think I'm a thriller person. Maybe I'll give some a try. I haven't gotten quite there. But the story behind this one is you have this family, a Korean-American mom, American dad, and there are 3 kids. The 2 oldest are twins, and then the youngest child has 2 conditions. He's on the autism spectrum and has something called, I think it's Angelman syndrome, where he constantly looks like he's happy and he can't communicate. And that becomes the scenario that opens it up, because the story opens up with him running back, which is something that's very difficult for him because he has motor functionality issues. He comes running back, but Dad's not there and he's got blood on his clothes. What happened to Dad? Dad is now missing. And that is the conflict driving the plot along. This is told from the main character's point of view. Her name is Mia, which, interestingly enough, there have been a lot of Mias as main characters, and I'm just now realizing that. I really enjoyed the perspective that you get here in them trying to figure out what happened to their father. Was it a tragic accident? Was it their dad running off and leaving his special needs son alone? Was it the son, Eugene, having a fit and accidentally contributing to the death of their father? Was it something malicious in the son? Trying to figure all of this out. And it's set during the height of COVID. It's set in 2020. I think it opens up in April of 2020, which poses an interesting perspective as well on how people were dealing with all of these different issues. And I found myself constantly fascinated by what was going on and the issues brought up in how or if Eugene can communicate, and what people thought of him, looking at him, how they considered him. Did they consider him as less than, as less intelligent, simply because he couldn't communicate? There are a lot of fascinating, utterly fascinating things brought up in this book. And I'm glad that this is the last book that I get to talk about. Unfortunately, it wasn't the last book I read, but I'm glad that this is the last book that I'm talking about to end it on a high note. This also got a 4.5 stars. Out of all of the books that I read this week, 3 of them were 4.5 stars, and 1 of them was a DNF. And that's interesting. I have only 4 books here this week, so it definitely was a week in which I did not read quite as much. However, I'm making really good progress on all of my goals, and my copy of Spy Family Volume 2 came in the mail. I'm so excited to get started with that. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.